and I had to decide whether I was going to get on the night.
Very important that the school lunch certain.
You signed up for a sailing program, but you don't know how to sail. And I said, because I don't know how to sail. I grew up in a family of storytellers. My maternal grandmother, who I called Nana, came to America from Ireland many years before I was born. She often told us stories about Ireland, and some of them were even Irish ghost stories with poltergeists. I recall one story she told of a dream she had about her sister Maggie, who was back in Ireland. In the dream, a coffin opened to reveal Maggie lying dead inside. She woke from the dream in tears, very worried about her sister. Some weeks later, a letter arrived from Ireland telling her that Maggie had died, and on the very date of her dream. Nana's visits to our home in Lexington when I was a young girl were always happy times. My mother would put on the kettle for tea as soon as Nana arrived from the city. And then my sister Kathy and I would sit at the kitchen table, eating cookies and drinking tea and listening with rapt attention to the stories. At that time, Nana still had a bit of a brogue, and she sometimes used words in Gaelic that we didn't understand. She used the word Armadan to call somebody an idiot. When she came to visit, she always baked bread and filled the house with a delicious aroma. When we smelled the bread baking, we knew that soon Nana's special treat would arrive. With the leftover bread dough, she would make what she called flum joes, which were something like a warm donut filled with grape jelly. They were so yummy. My Nana was born Ellen Keogh in County Kildare, Ireland on June 11th, 1873. When she was 15, she traveled by herself to America. I found her name on the passenger list of the SS Catalonia that arrived in Boston from Liverpool, England on September 17th, 1888. Did that lovely young girl realize that when she stepped on that ship, she would never again see her parents or Ireland? She traveled in the steerage section of the ship and became very seasick. Her sister Lizzie had come to America before her, and Lizzie was working for a Senator Reed in Boston. Lizzie saved up her money to pay her sister's fare and also got her a job working as a maid in Senator Reed's household. My grandfather, Lawrence O'Reilly, had arrived in America the very same year, but from Waterford Island. They would later meet at an Irish social club and marry in 1894. This picture was taken on their wedding day. He called her Nellie and she called him Larry. And they had 7 children, but 2 died when they were infants. Nana and Larry did not find the streets paved with gold when they arrived in America. Instead, there were signs in shop windows that read, "No Irish need apply." And at that time, there was no social safety net, no welfare or unemployment. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. And so the Irish felt unwelcome, and they stayed close together and close to the Catholic Church for support. Their previous experiences with the famine back in Ireland and also the subhuman way the Irish were treated by the English Protestants reinforced that behavior. The English tried to take their language away from them, but many of the Irish studied it secretly. Nana taught me how to bless myself in Gaelic. Nana Mahanaha, August and Vic, August and Speed, Ni Amen. Nana and Larry and their children settled in a tenement on Hancock Street in Cambridge, where 4 families shared one toilet. They were very poor and hungry most of the time. My mother recalled being sent to the butcher shop to ask for free bones for the dog. Of course, they had no dog. They couldn't afford a dog. But when Nana got the bones, she would boil them for hours to get the goodness from the marrow to make a healthy soup. And she would augment that with free stale bread from the bakery. There was an enormous influx of Irish immigrants to the Cambridge and Boston area at the end of the 19th century. More people than could safely be absorbed by the overtaxed sewer and school systems. Larry searched for work for a long time and was very grateful when he finally found work improving the sewer system for the city of Cambridge. His boss was Tip O'Neill's father, who was the head of the Public Works Department. Disease was a major concern, and tuberculosis societies were formed. My mother, when she was 8 years old, in 1913, was removed from the public school in Cambridge, along with her 2 younger sisters, because they were so frail and at risk. At that time, open-air societies were, open-air schools were being established, and she was sent, along with her sisters, to the Felton Open Air School, which was over at Fresh Pond in Cambridge. The open-air societies were not just in Cambridge, they were across the country, and they were successful in combating disease and nourishing the children physically. My mother remembered being given good meals, a toothbrush, new shoes, and rubbers. And on pleasant days, the children would take blankets and walk over to Fresh Pond and rest under the trees. And every child was given a garden to tend. And my mother won a prize for growing the biggest kohlrabi, which was her biggest achievement at that school. Nellie continued to work for the Brahmin families when she wasn't giving birth or nursing babies. And one woman, Mrs. Walter, that she worked for, sent her to the Fanny Farmer Cooking School in Boston, and she became an excellent chef. And when Mrs. Walter would have a big party, and Nana did the cooking, it was likely that Nana would be able to take home some leftovers to her children. When Nana and Larry, they struggled, and they had to use their wits, but they were met with kindness and care by some people. In 1947, when I was 8 years old, my parents convinced me to become pen pals with my cousin Betty McGrath in Ireland. Betty and I were the same age and had the same first name, so we started writing to each other and continued for many years, sending letters and Christmas cards. We would never meet in person until 1992, when Jack and I made a trip to Ireland. My mother had been the last of her siblings to die in 1991, and I worried that the old family stories would die with me when I left this world. So when we were in Dublin, I called my cousin Betty on the phone, and she was still living in Waterford, where she used to live when I wrote to her, and she invited us to come visit. Her husband had died, but we got to meet 4 of her 6 children. It was a very nice and special visit, Betty showed me a photo of me in my first communion dress at age 7 that I had sent to her. And I told her that I still had the photo she sent to me of her in her Irish step dancing costume at age 9. So we promised to keep in touch. Then Jack and I went to County Kildare, and we were able to find the ruins of Carberry Castle, where Nana used to bury her dolls when they died. We couldn't find her birth certificate at that time, but a couple of years later, my cousin Paul went to Ireland and did find it. And with that document, he was able to prove his lineage to Nana and become a dual citizen of Ireland and the United States. In 1993, Betty and her daughter Sandra came from Ireland and visited us here in Groton. While they were here, I planned a gathering of the O'Reilly clan and invited all of Betty's American cousins who had never met her before. It was a fun gathering, and I was also able to gather a lot of the milestone information that I needed because I was working on a family tree. And in 2009, I had collected a lot of information and was able to create a family gift book. And I also included old photographs. And I gave it to people who had come to the gathering. The name of the book was The O'Reilly Family, History and Genealogy Chart, 1840 to 2009. Well, storytelling in my Nana's day was the only way she knew to share the stories and the history of our family. She was literate, that is, she could read and write, but she labored hard her whole life and never had the privilege of time to write down her stories. When I was studying for my master's degree in 1986, I interviewed some family members about their recollections of Nana for a paper I was writing. And here is what my sister Kathy told me. She said, Nana was a heroine, a nice but independent and tough woman who held the family together. Once when I was being teased by some boys, she ran to the front door and swore at them in Gaelic. My Nana died at age 80 in 1954 when I was in high school, but I still have strong memories of her and her stories. Now I am a Nana myself, and I will turn 80 this year. Her story began in the 19th century, and mine will undoubtedly end in the 21st. I created the family gift book to preserve the old stories because I've always loved a good story, and I've always had my head buried in a book since I was a young girl. My husband complains that I talk in paragraphs when he's looking for a shorter answer. But anyway, I tell a story of some sorts, and sometimes I even throw in a song. Nana sang the Irish lullaby to me and all of her other grandchildren when we were infants. And my mother sang that song to me as well. And I sang this song to my children and my grandchildren. Over in Killarney, many years ago, my mother sang this song to me in tones so sweet and low. Just a simple little ditty in her good old Irish way. And I'd give the world if she could sing that song to me this day. Toralora, 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 hush now, don't you cry. Toralora, Thank you for listening.
My new job as food service director for the Waltham Public Schools. My most urgent and pressing problem was the state was starting a mandate, and the federal government, for school lunch in every single session school. Waltham had 16 elementary schools without any food service at all, nor did they have any kitchen facilities where we could get a kitchen up and running. So with only 4 weeks to go before school would open, we decided to go with a school lunch. And I spent the next week or so working with the city purchasing agent, bringing up the specifications for a federal school lunch bid. And it's very important that the school lunch has certain specifications that have to be met if you're going to get reimbursed from both the state and the federal government. And you have to have those components for every school lunch. It's got to be so much protein, so much fruit and vegetables, so much grain, and a bottle of milk. The winner of the bid was a company by the name of Astro Foods. It was a startup owned and operated by the person whose job I had just taken over. And as I would go down in the next few months working with suppliers and vendors, I would come to find out that this individual was not necessarily ethical or honest. So it should have, if I had known more, I should have come no surprise that this person would start delivering meals that did not meet the specifications for school lunch. And one day, they delivered to the schools, among other things, a small piece of applesauce cake, probably about 1 inch by 1 inch. And that was supposed to be a fresh apple. Well, I called up, and the next day, one of the representatives from the company, a guy named Jerry Cordino, came down and started telling me that that applesauce cake was definitely the same nutrition as an apple. Well, discussion went right downhill. And it ended when he said he knew people who could have me lose my job. Well, that was concerning to say the least. So the first thing I did when he left is I called my boss, and my boss listened and said, "Don't worry about it." So I put it off and didn't think anything more of it. About a week later, another sales rep that I had calling on me was a young fellow who was raised in Waltham. His name is John Capadona. And John was not a conventional salesman in terms of his dress. He was more casual, but the clothes he wore were really nicely made, and John was very good about his appearance. His nails were manicured, his black curly hair almost glistened, and there's no question John looked very Italian. And in the colder weather, he liked to wear a black leather overcoat, drove a black Corvette, things like that. So I told John the story as our conversation is going on, and John says to me, "He's nothing but a punk. I know somebody who will drop him in the middle of the ocean for $500. Now, I didn't, Waltham is fairly Italian population. They make up a significant part of the citizenry. And even where I grew up in Connecticut, it seems that we all knew somebody who might be a wise guy. So it wouldn't surprise me if they knew him in Waltham, but I hadn't been in Waltham long enough to know much of anything. And I'm saying to myself, I don't believe this. John, you're just trying to make me feel good. So I let it go with that. But I did go home and tell my wife, Diane, what was going on, and we let it go. About a week or two later, John pays me another visit, and I said to him, John, I'm looking for a particular paper product, because that's what John represented, was an Aero paper company and supplies. And I think your father might have this item that I'm looking for. Now, his dad and two partners in Waltham owned a family entertainment complex called the Wallachs, and it was bowling alley, skating rink, miniature golf, and a food stand. So we go down to the food stand. It's only 1 or 2 minutes from where my office was. And I meet John's father, same height as about John, beautiful white hair, very soft-spoken. And after we look at some things, John tells his father the story about Jerry Corradino. His father says, he's nothing but a punk. Did you tell him about Chicky? Then I knew that this was real. But I wasn't going to act on it. I didn't ask for it. I didn't follow up on it. But I do go home and tell Diane. I think within the week, I get a call in the office from Jerry Corradino. He's apologizing all over the place because he doesn't understand this talk about broken legs. Well, I knew it was real. So I told Diane again, and we let it go. We didn't act on anything. Now, I just got to make a little bit of a side here. When we were in college, we had a friend who liked to do pranks on us. And little did we know that he was going to pull one on us not too far from now. So Diane is at home, and she gets a phone call. And they ask for me. She says, well, I'm at home. And she asks, who's this calling? And the person on the other end says, this is the FBI. We need to talk to your husband because we have an allegation that he has threatened someone harm. And Diane is completely bewildered and taken aback. And the person on the other end must have sensed this. So he says to her, Diane, don't you know who this is? It's Kasvik from college. Little did he know how close he had come to really knowing the whole story. And that's my story.
For those of you who flew on the Delta shuttle prior to September 11th, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yes.
For those of you who have flown on the shuttle since September 11th, you'll have a pretty good sense of what I'm talking about. And for those of you who have never flown on Delta shuttle to New York, let me explain. There was, in fact, a golden age of flying. Back when you could actually get on a plane, there'd be an empty middle seat between you and your neighbor. Back before you had to take your shoes off in order to get on a plane. For a while after the shoe bomber, as we were standing in line barefoot, I would always turn to the person behind me and say, thank God he didn't put the bomb in his underwear. And then, of course, there was the underwear bomber who ruined that perfectly good joke. So back then in this golden age, I could literally wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning, jump in the shower, get dressed, jump in my car. I lived in Concord, drive to Logan, make a beeline from the garage straight to the gate. There was no security. And back then, when you got to the gate area, there was a machine that looked like an ATM. And you would buy your ticket right there on the spot with open seating. Then you would just walk to the gate, grab a newspaper, wait in the makeshift line, board the plane, grab a seat, and 45 minutes later, you were landing in LaGuardia. Take a run down, grab a cab, and I could be at my desk in Midtown Manhattan, 8 o'clock in the morning. So pillow to desk in 3 hours flat. Every once in a while, something interesting happened. One time I got on the plane and Spike Lee was sitting in the first row by the window. For those of you who know me, you know where I sat, right in the aisle next to him, chatted him up all the way to Boston. And that was fun. Another time, it was January of 1985, I was flying back in the afternoon, and I was seated by the window, and a woman around my age sat down in the aisle seat. So of course we started chatting, and she said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm the chief operating officer of a heavy equipment manufacturer in Boston." She said, "Well, that sounds pretty good." I said, "It's all right." I said, "What do you do?" She said, "I manage a rock and roll band." I was like, "A rock and roll band?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Have I ever heard of this rock and roll band?" And she said, "Well, I imagine you probably have." I said, "Well, who is it?" She said, "Bruce Springsteen." So she could have said Bruce. She could have said the boss. My heart was sort of like, but I was cool. I was cool. Because Bruce would have wanted it that way, you know? So of course we talked all the way back. And as the plane was touching down at Logan, I turned to her and I said, "Look, the concert's in a few days. I've been a really good boy. Tickets. I'd really like some tickets." And she said, "No problem. There'll be 2 tickets waiting for you at the will call window." And they were there. There were 2 tickets at the will call window, and the concert was just beyond amazing. And my ears rang for 3 days. So that's Exhibit A. Exhibit B is, it was just another day in the golden age. And I was working for IBM, and a colleague, Jim, and I had a meeting with AXA Insurance at 10 a.m. in Manhattan. AXA is a very large French insurance and financial services company. So because the meeting was at 10, I got to sleep in. I didn't take the 6:30 shuttle. I took the 7:30 shuttle instead. Now, if you've flown the shuttle before and often enough, you begin to learn some of the idiosyncrasies. And one of them is that there are 2 primary flight paths that the plane takes. The first one is exactly what you would imagine. The plane takes off out of Logan, flies right down the New England coast, and then just glides straight into LaGuardia, straight shot, exactly what you'd imagine. That happens probably 75% of the time. Around 25% of the time, the plane goes right down the coast, and somewhere down around southern Connecticut, Westchester County, the pilot banks to the right. You're now flying over Westchester County, over the upper reaches of Manhattan. You're in your final descent. Plane banks to the left, and you're coming straight down the Hudson River. And it's low and slow. It's as if you're suspended in air. And you see the Upper West Side, you see the Empire State Building, Lower Manhattan, and then the plane loops around on its edge, right around the Statue of Liberty. You feel like you can just put your hand out and touch the torch. You're that close. And it glides right into Manhattan, into LaGuardia. So it was a beautiful morning, and in fact, we were flying, and now comes the secret. The secret is that when you fly on the shuttle, if that's going to happen, you want to be in the second row on the left by the window. Best seat in the house. So I got on the plane that morning, and luck was with me. Grabbed my seat, and we're heading down the coast, and we get to southern Connecticut, and sure enough, the plane banks to the right, and it's like, we're in luck. Here we go. So we cut across Manhattan, we come down the Hudson, it's beautiful. We loop around the Statue of Liberty, we land in LaGuardia. If you know that what happens, because on the shuttle, it's just a bunch of people who have flown a million times, when the plane lands and stops and the bell goes off, it's just like, all rise. You know, everybody gets up, and that plane empties. It feels like it empties in about 2 minutes. So, and then everybody just sort of briskly walks through the terminal and to the taxi stand. And so I went down, grabbed a taxi, opened up the newspaper, and we're off. And several minutes into the flight, into the drive, there's a little rap on the partition. And the driver goes, look.
Oh.
And off in the distance were the World Trade Towers with a plume of charcoal-colored smoke pouring outside into the horizon. At that point, nobody knew what was happening. He turned on the radio. They said a small plane had crashed into the building. Of course, the story started to develop as we went into Manhattan. He dropped me off at the IBM building. And I met my colleague Jim there. And of course, everybody was just in a state of shock. But New York being surreal, we actually got on the phone and called AXA Insurance to see if the meeting was postponed. Well, of course it was postponed. So we made our way downstairs. There was a large flat screen TV on the wall, and everybody was just huddled around the TV, and we watched the towers fall, and we just watched the news for a while, and then somewhere around 11 or 11:30, we sort of looked at each other and said, I don't know, being in an IBM building in the middle of Manhattan on a day like that may not be the brightest idea. So we grabbed our briefcases and we went downstairs and we went outside and we walked down the street and we walked into a hotel bar. We ordered a drink. TV was going off in the corner. We had a drink, stepped outside onto the sidewalk, gave each other a hug, and Jim said to me, where are you going? And I said, well, my cousin lives on the Upper West Side, 96 and Riverside. I'm going to walk up there and figure it out. I said, what about you? He said, I'm walking downtown. I want to help. I'm sure they need help. There are only a few times in a person's life when you're faced with a really big decision in real time with no time to think about it. And there I was. And I didn't even take that moment to think. I knew I was not going downtown with them. I had flown down in a plane from Boston minutes before the hijackers. Perhaps the last plane to fly down the Hudson, certainly one of the last people to see the towers from the air, and I was scared. So we hugged again, and I walked uptown, he walked downtown. The Marines have an expression, run towards the sound of chaos. And here I was, walking in the opposite direction. I thought that I would beat myself up perhaps for the rest of my life over this decision. It felt cowardly, it felt selfish. But that's not what happened. Something better happened. I decided it just wasn't my time. It just wasn't my time. And I was in good company that day. And if that had been the end of it, then I think it would have felt cowardly. But what I did was I made a pledge to myself, and I said, my time will come, and I'll make good on this. And fast forward 8 years, 2008, February of 2008, if you remember, it was the absolute depth of the recession. Companies were laying off literally 750,000 people a month. Well, I was still working for IBM, and I retired from IBM. Why, you ask? Would somebody who loves their job, loves their company, why would somebody choose to retire at the worst possible moment? And the answer is that IBM helped me with the decision. They laid off 15,000 people over the course of 2 weeks, and I was one of them. But they didn't exactly lay me off. They did allow me, they did offer to let me keep my job if I was willing to move on my own to India to work for the local wage and get paid in rupees. So I thought that over. No, I didn't think that over. But it was a little levity. So anyway, I settled in and I ran the numbers and I realized I don't have to work anymore, I can retire. And that's when I realized that my time had come. So for the past 10 years, I've done pro bono consulting to the leadership of around 40 different nonprofits, primarily in Lowell, also Worcester, Boston, surrounding communities. I've mentored hundreds of inner city high school students in Boston and Lowell, and I cook for community dinner for people who really need a meal. It's been the most gratifying work of my life. Back in 2012, I was fortunate enough to be able to work on a strategic plan with a minister and congregation of Unitarian Church right here in Groton. It turns out that the minister and I somehow fell in love, and we got married last year. Many of you were there. So believe me, you have to believe me. It was never part of the plan. American Airlines Flight 11 took off minutes after my plane took off. Had the hijackers not been so thorough in their planning, had they not insisted on taking a plane destined for Los Angeles because that plane was full of jet fuel and that would maximize the inferno, they most likely would have chosen my plane, the one that was already heading straight for the towers. And there I would have been, row 2 by the window, hoping for a great view of Manhattan, probably within arm's reach of one of the hijackers. I'd like to think I would have done what I could if it had been my flight, but it wasn't my flight. And the rest is just conjecture. So I know what you're all thinking. What about Jim? Jim walked downtown. It turns out that there wasn't much for civilians to do, but that was never the point. Jim and I have remained friends. We stay in touch every September 11th. I told him I was telling the story tonight, and he said to say hello to you all. As for me, I made my way home over the next couple of days, and the boarding pass. I took the boarding pass and I bought a little frame, and it's been sitting on my desk for 18 years. And it's a good reminder. Back to those Marines. Turns out Jim was a former Marine. Who knew? He was used to running towards the chaos. Me, not so much. At least not that day. If you're one of those folks who can run towards the chaos, then go with Godspeed. If, like me, it's just not your moment, I'm here to assure you that when your moment comes, you can stop, turn around, and walk slowly back towards the chaos. It'll be there waiting for you. Thank you.
Standing on bottom of the gangplank, and the ship's whistle blew, and I had to decide whether I was going to get on the night boat from Spain to North Africa. I had my ticket in my hand. I was the last one on the gangplank, but an hour earlier, a fortune teller had told me, "Don't go on this boat. Go tomorrow and everything's okay. If you go on this boat, you end up in jail." What do I do? The whistle blew and I stepped on the gangplank and ran up. I was on board. I had a third-class sleeper ticket for this overnight ferry, and I went deep down into the bowel of the ship, and there was a little room with a small door and 2 bunks on each side, and 3 men were already in the other 3 bunks. And so I had the 4th bunk. I climbed in, and they were talking French, so I greeted them in French, and they switched to Arabic. And I took a look at them, and I said, I don't know if this is what the fortune teller was talking about. So I slept with one eye open, holding my backpack. The next morning, I was at the top of the gangplank, walking down into Ceuta, a Spanish naval base in North Africa. And as I was coming down the gangplank, I saw the 3 gentlemen that were in my room standing at the bottom of the gangplank with a policeman pointing to me. And when I got down to the bottom, the policeman said, "Give me the papers to the Mercedes." And I went, "I don't know what papers you mean." And he said, "These men said you were in their cabin last night and you stole the papers." And just then, there was a Mercedes rolling out. I kind of understood what was happening, and I decided, stay cool. Remembering the fortune teller's advice. The policeman took all 4 of us into a prison van with all 4 of us in back, drove to the main police station, which was an old medieval castle, I mean horrendous, with moss even on the inside walls. And the policeman sat down at a typewriter and interviewed us and hunt and pecked the responses on the typewriter. And then he said, when the police chief comes in, he'll decide. So we sat there for a couple hours. I tried to make friends with the Algerians. And when the chief came in, he looked at the script. He couldn't make much of it. And he said, "Did you examine his backpack?" and slapped the policeman on the back of his head. And the policeman said no, and so they spread out everything on the floor and didn't find the Mercedes papers. And so the police chief said, "I have to think about this." Another 2 hours waiting. And then he came out and he said, "I've made my decision. This is a crime that happened on the high seas. It is out of my jurisdiction. The Admiral of the Navy needs to decide this." So again, we were ushered into the prison van and driven across town to the base where we had landed. And we were brought into a magnificent Moorish castle, high rooms with arches and mosaics on the walls and tiled floors. And we were sat down. And we waited for another 2 hours. And while we were waiting, there was a little sailor pushing one of those big brooms, systematically covering that whole huge expanse of tiles. And every few minutes, he stuck his hand in his pants and scratched himself, looked around and pulled his hands out. And this then became the theater for 2 hours. Finally, the Admiral arrived. And he was resplendent, a tailored uniform, full of medals. For an admiral, it was interesting, he had riding boots on and a real magnificent cap. And he started interviewing us in Spanish, and there was a lot at stake here, so all 4 of us said, "Try French, okay?" And the Admiral went, "Does anyone speak French here?" And the little sailor who was pushing the broom said, "I do." And so then he was brought over next to the Admiral. And the Admiral stood there resplendent and just looked at us. He never looked at the sailor. And as the sailor was translating, he still couldn't control himself. Every few minutes, his hands would go into his pants. And being stared at by the Admiral, I had to make sure that I did not smile. I did not want me going to jail being about smiling at the Admiral. So we did a lot of questions, and once again, the Admiral said, I have to weigh this. And so we waited for another 2 hours. And then the Admiral came out and he said, I have decided the justice in this matter. He says, I don't know about the facts of this crime, but I know 2 things. And this is how much of the world operates. I know that Algerians are liars and thieves. And I know that Americans are so wealthy, they would never steal something. I was surprised. I wasn't going to complain. And then he turned to the sailor, the little guy, and held out his car keys and said, drive the American out of town and get him on his way to Fez. And then he turned to the Algerians and he said, if you're not out of my town in an hour, you're going to prison and I'm throwing away the key. And then he paused, and I'm keeping the Mercedes. Justice. So the little sailor was driving me, and it was starting to get dark. Remember, I'd started early that day, and we reached a crossroads in the middle of nowhere, and he said, this is as far as I can take you. And I got out with my backpack, and I decided to wait a little bit to see if somebody else was coming along so I could hitchhike. But most people who drove between cities would start in the morning, so nobody came. So this wasn't a desert with sand. This was like hard scrabble emptiness out there. So I walked about 100 yards into a field and decided I was dead tired. I hadn't slept the night before. And there was a little cave about 4 feet high and about 8 feet deep. And I looked in, there were no snakes. And so I decided to go to sleep there. And I was just out. And then about 4 in the morning, I felt bodies all around me. And I felt that they smelled like animal bodies. And I went, oh my God, you know, this is not a good ending to this story. And so I didn't want to breathe, I didn't want to move, I just stayed quiet until it got light. And when it got light, I noticed that they were sheep. I crawled out among the sheep, and they were looking at me like, who's this guy? And outside, sitting on a rock, was the shepherd and his dog, and he saw me crawling out, and he went, what's going on? And I said, I know, I should have taken the ferry the next day.
So this is 35 years ago. I was a special education teacher at Newton North High School in Newtonville. I was a learning disabilities teacher at the high school. Had 4 children. I lived in Needham. And there was an assembly at the high school, mostly for the juniors and seniors. And there were representatives who came to this assembly to talk to the juniors and seniors about programs that they might be interested in the summertime. One of the representatives was from a program called Outward Bound. I had never heard of it at all. And this representative talked about the challenges that were inherent in this Outward Bound program. Physical challenges, mental challenges, emotional challenges. And the motto for Outward Bound was, face your fears and do it anyway, as well as expect the best, prepare for the worst. So this is 35 years ago. I had never heard any rhetoric like that at all. It was all news to me, and it sounded really kind of like exciting. And I sat there in the assembly thinking, if I had had a program like that when I was in high school, it could have changed my life. And I'm thinking, that winter I was turning 50. And I'm thinking, if I could figure out how I could take a program like that, an Outward Bound program, that would be kind of exciting. Now, 35 years ago, women in their 50s were not looking for challenges like that. It was a little bit unusual. I couldn't stop thinking about it. At home, on the phone, so this is before Dr. Google, remember, 35 years ago. On the phone, I get a little bit of information from the Outward Bound administrator, Outward Bound in Maine. And in fact, there is a summer program when I'm not going to be teaching in August on Outward Bound, and it's a sailing program. And I feel really comfortable on the water because I grew up on Salisbury Beach. And it's called a Women's Challenge Program for Women over 30. And I say, well, I'm 50. Is that going to make a difference? And the administrator says, no, just send in your deposit and we'll send you what you should pack and directions and information. And so on the phone, I was able to sign up for it. The day comes in August, and this is before GPS. I find my way to East Penobscot Bay in Maine, to the harbor, and I meet the other 9 women in the program. These are women probably in their early 30s. Didn't seem to make any difference to them that I was 50, and 2 really wonderful sounding instructors. So there were 10 participants and 2 instructors. And the instructors take us down to the dock, to the harbor, to the sailing boat, and we look at the sailing boat, and it looks very odd. I think once a friend had taken me sailing. This did not look like a sailing boat that I had remembered. It turns out there was an old Coast Guard pulling boat. So the instructors tell us how to get on the boat, and it has sails. It has these massive oars, big, heavy wooden oars, and wooden benches. So we all get on, we're sitting down, and there's a motor on the boat, and one of the instructors starts motoring toward Outward Bound, which is on a very large island. That's where the program is administered. And the 9 of us kind of like look at each other and start talking about the bathroom. And one of us said to one of the instructors, so is the bathroom like down below, like underneath? And the instructor said, you walk to the bow of the boat, you put your feet under the gunwale, and you put the rest of you over the side of the boat, and you hope that the wind is blowing in the right direction. Expect the best, prepare for the worst. So we motor to Outward Bound, and we get off the sailing boat, and we go in, and we have our lunch, and then we're all expecting to be shown to our dorm room. Come to find out we're going to sleep on the boat. So if you put the oars like this, and you have a sleeping bag, which is what they told us to bring, you can sleep on the oars, which is what we did. So we slept on the boat, we prepared our food on the boat, we ate on the boat, and we began to learn a little bit about sailing. And I remember 2 of the women were really good sailors, and they said to me, why would you sign up for a sailing program if you don't know how to sail? And I said, because I don't know how to sail. So instruction about sailing for a couple of days, and then the instructors get us back to Outward Bound. And we're getting off the sailing boat, and who knows what we're going to do, because this was all about things I knew nothing about. We get off the boat onto the island, and they take us to the one of the docks. And on the dock is a diving board. And we're going to jump off the diving board into the water. So I have a really, really serious fear of heights. Plus, I have never seen a diving board. I didn't go to camp. I grew up on Salisbury Beach. I knew about high tide and low tide and seaweed and sand and flirting with lifeguards. That's what I knew. I had no idea what you do with a diving board, so I volunteered to go first because I was terrified. So I walk along the diving board and I look down and the ocean is really, really far down, and I say to myself, and I go to the end of the line. 9 other women walk onto the diving board, jump into the water, and then it's finally my turn, and one of the instructors is standing beside me smiling, and I walk to the end of the diving board and I say to myself, you don't have to do this. And as soon as I gave myself permission to not do it, I held my nose and I jumped. We get back on the sailing boat, there's more instructions about sailing. We're sleeping on the boat, we're eating on the boat. We have to volunteer to stay up 2 hours each night to make sure that everybody is safe. So there's safety built into this. And when there's no wind, we have to row. So we all figured out how to negotiate those huge oars on which we were sleeping. We were getting pretty friendly with the oars. And after a couple of days, we were instructed to either sail or paddle back to Outward Bound, getting ready for something that has nothing to do with sailing. We start hiking through the woods. And we're hiking and we're climbing, and it's getting higher and higher, and my fear of heights is really clicking in. We're climbing and climbing and climbing to what seems to me to be like the top of the cliff, and the ocean is down below. And the instructors tell us that we are going to rappel backwards off the cliff. I know one meaning for the word rappel, and it had nothing to do with whatever they were talking about. So I have a safety belt, and the instructor hooks a rope onto my safety belt, and the rope is connected to one of the other women who is wrapped around a tree, and evidently she is going to slowly let the rope out, and I am going to walk backward down this cliff, down to the water. And I think to myself, this is a sailing program. And I knew enough to not look down. I also knew enough that I couldn't take in the whole experience, that I could maybe make it smaller. And what I discovered was that I could put one foot behind the other, otherwise known as one step at a time. So now, this is all mindfulness, but 35 years ago, I had never heard anything like that. And I put one foot behind the other and finally got down on the sand. And I was so happy to get back on the sailing boat. It's a little bit more sailing. This is a 10-day Women's Challenge program. A few more days of instructions about sailing, which felt wonderful because there were no heights. It had nothing to do with heights. We were on my beloved Atlantic Ocean. And then we're sailing back towards Outward Bound, and I'm thinking, oh, what have they devised for us now? And I hear the word solo. So I know what solo means. We are going to be taken, each of us, each of the 10 of us, to one of the smaller islands, and we are going to do an overnight solo. So keeping in mind that for all these days, I have been sleeping with and eating with and rowing with 10 other people. So they let us off on this little tiny island, and we're given water and trail mix, and I think peanut butter sandwiches, because at that time in Maine, there was a drought. So you couldn't light any fires, so we couldn't heat up any food. So they gave us what they could, and a foraging book. Fortunately, I knew how to read, and I took instructions, and I think that I might have identified some wild garlic or maybe parsley or something. And the boatman comes once a day and waves, and if I'm okay, I wave back. Now, this is before cell phones, so I wave to the boatman, and when it's time to go to bed, I have my sleeping bag, and I make myself as comfortable as I possibly can by putting my head on my jacket, and I'm alone for the first time in a long time on this program. And the sounds at night were really, really creepy. And I was so glad when the boatman came back to get us, and again, I was so glad to get onto the sailing boat. So there's a few more days of instructions about sailing, and I'm getting a little bit of it and getting to know the other women. And once again, we are sailing or paddling, depending on whether there's wind, back to Outward Bound. And I'm hearing the instructors talk about something called the ropes course, about which I knew nothing. So at that same time on the island was a group of teenage boys from East Boston who were also doing a challenge program. And I figure this ropes course, it sounded like it had something to do with height, must be for the teenage boys. No, it was for the Women's Challenge program for women over 30. So we walk through the woods and we come to this ropes course that goes up really, really high. And my heart is already in my mouth. And each of us begins climbing on the ropes, stepping where we can, climbing. And then I hear one of the other women screaming, "I can't do it, I've got to go home, I can't do it." And the instructor saying, "It's okay, Ellie, just come down, you'll be fine." And I say to myself, I'm not going to do that. And I keep on climbing, and I finally reach what seems to be the top. I can't go any higher. And I think, okay, what now? And the instructor yells, "Look for the ladder, look for the ladder." And I look around, and there is this wimpy rope ladder flapping in the breeze. And I get it. I have to get on this rope ladder and get myself to the ground. So I somehow get on the rope ladder, and I have to decide if I'm going to go down backwards or if I'm going to go down frontwards, and I'm not going to look down. And I make my way down 1 foot at a time until the ladder is close enough to the ground so that I can jump off and hit the ground running. I didn't pick up any independent sailing skills those 10 days on Outward Bound. But what I learned about myself, about I can face my fears and do it anyway. I can decide I'm not going to do it. I can expect the best and prepare for the worst. Those lessons that I learned 35 years ago have stayed with me to this day, that I got on Outward Bound when I turned 50. Thank you.
I'm going to tell a story about the power of storytelling. In 1988, a little-known videographer named Ken Burns, I see the nods in the audience, put a show on PBS, 6-part show on the Civil War. Our son was 8 years old. Typical 8-year-old, interested in hockey and friends. For some reason, we let him watch the first night. He was transfixed by the Civil War series.
Okay.
We let him stay up for 6 nights till 10 o'clock. This actually led to some disagreements with my wife, who didn't think a 3rd grader should be staying up until 10 o'clock watching television. But Ken Burns and the PBS series on the Civil War carried the day. 2 years later, as a 5th grader, Turner participated in a mentoring program at his school in which he was paired up with a grandfather who was a Civil War buff. And they talked history in the Civil War, the entire program. The end of the program was a performance. Dressed as Robert E. Lee, our 5th grade son gave an interview describing the war from the Southern perspective, reading letters from soldiers home. I sat in the audience, as did my wife, just weak-kneed. And as I looked around, I saw other parents with tears in their eyes. In 7th grade, Turner joined the 10th Massachusetts Reenactment Company in Northampton. He was the only young man among a somewhat strange collection of adult reenactors. But they took him under their wing, and they were terrific. And for 2 years, I chauffeured my 12-year-old son around New England reenactments, and drove him out to quarterly meetings of the 10th Massachusetts Reenactment Company. Obligatory to those trips was dinner at a place called Miss Florence's Diner in Florence, Massachusetts, outside of Northampton. But I promise you, I know we have Johnson's. This has the best cheeseburgers and blueberry pie, and by the way, the cheapest, which appealed to me, in New England. And Turner would not let us go to these meetings unless we went to Miss Florence Diner. The next year, on spring vacation from school, Turner and I did the obligatory father-son trip to the Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania battlefields. Fredericksburg, Charlottesville, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Harper's Ferry. Now, I majored in history and I teach history, but after a while, battlefields start to look kind of like battlefields. And all you want to do is have a beer. Turner's old enough now to say, Dad, we got to be authentic. You're going to drink watery cider and eat hardtack. By the time we got to Gettysburg, the end of the journey, Turner, the reenactor, announces, Dad, we have to do the battlefield the way it was done in July 1863. Over 3 days. Day 1, up and down Culp's Hill. Day 2, the Peach Orchard, Devil's Den, Little Round Top. Do the obligatory honorarium to Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Day 3, by this point, all I wanted to do was get back to Boston and the Red Sox. But anyway, day 3, Pickett's Charge. Well, you all know what Pickett's Charge is. What you don't know is if you go to Gettysburg, from Seminary Ridge, where the Confederates were, to Cemetery Ridge on a hot day, pretty close to a mile. But there we did it. We did the entire Pickett's charge. All the while, I'm looking a little beat up, and my son is saying to me, "Dad, we gotta be authentic."
Okay.
Shortly thereafter, actually, some of you may remember this, Ted Turner produced a movie called Gettysburg, which was a reenactment of the battle in 1863, using reenactors from as far away as Virginia and probably Mississippi. And I don't know how many thousand reenactors from the North. The 10th Massachusetts was in that movie. I know that because Turner and I saw it about 6 times. And if you look very carefully, as the Confederates are charging up the ridge in Pickett's Charge, there's a reddish blonde teenager looking over the wall at the advancing Confederates. It's only on there for about 10 seconds, but it's worth seeing the movie 6 times. Today, our son Turner is a 38-year-old storyteller in song. He lives in Queens, New York, with his wife, Maddie, who writes children's books, and their 3-year-old son. He's the only person I know that read the entire 3-volume history of the Civil War written by the guy who was in the Ken Burns show. I'm drawing a blank on his name. The entire 3-volume history of that war. So it all began in 1988 with Ken Burns and that marvelous show on the Civil War that changed our son's life. So whether you're talking about Ken Burns or Will Rogers or Garrison Keillor or other storytellers that you may know better than I, we owe a debt to these people, and we are glad to have known them. That's my story.
What I remember best about the day is how blue it was, the sky. It was one of those perfect summer days, not a cloud in sight, a really deep blue color. Generally speaking, I would have shared the observation with my wife. She loves the outdoors. Unfortunately, at that particular moment, I didn't think she would be able to hear me over the whirring and the clunking of the really sharp blades that were whipping around about 2 feet over my head. And she was a little bit busy trying to lift a machine off me at the time. So I want to take a step back a little bit. I've got a good life. I've got a great life. And the fact is, we've got 2 dogs, a cat, a lizard, sometimes butterflies, depending on the time of year. They've got it better than a lot of people. And I remind myself of that on a regular basis because it helps me keep things in perspective. But just like anybody else, boredom tends to, kick in now and again. When I was young, that's more or less what led me to traipse around the country in Europe with a guitar. And I'd like to say I played some of the best street corners and some of the worst bars that can be found any place. Unfortunately, I'm not exaggerating. But the fact is that traipsing over time has sort of morphed into a lot more laundry loads and bus pickups and things like that. So what I end up doing is trying to find ways to entertain myself. And sometimes that works out quite well, sometimes not so much. Like the day that I found myself staring up at that blue sky, pinned under an upside down riding mower. So the house that we used to have had a very large yard, much larger than the one that we have here in Groton. By the way, just totally as an aside, I've been informed that people who are born and bred in Groton are Grotonians. I cannot claim that title. We've only been here 7 years, so I've started a club for newbies. We are Grotoneers. The dues are very low. You get a hat. Okay? Just keep it in mind. So anyway, the old house that we had out of Groton had a very large yard, and it led to an argument almost immediately when we moved in, which was lawn care. Now, my wife was absolutely convinced that I could take care of it with a push mower and possibly a goat. I've never asked about the goat. I don't want to know, but I had visions of tooling around, sipping an alcoholic beverage on a sunny summer day, riding a beast. For the first and probably only time in our 14 years together, I actually won the argument. So it was absolutely great at first. You know the people with big lawns, I'm sure you've seen this, those beautiful straight lines that go right there. Do you know how you make them? You've got to drive in straight lines over and over and talk about boring. So after a little bit, I decided to experiment, and I moved on to what we'll call geometric-ish shapes and designs, and I even took a crack at pictures, although I was the only one apparently who could see anything picture-ish in it. When I got to that stage, that actually did cause quite the conversations at our house. I think that the mildest and kindest thing that my loving bride said was, it looked like the whacking of a blind drunk guy. I will admit at this point she was half right, and I'll leave it to you to. So it also convinced me, by the way, that she was a sailor in a previous life, just based on some of the language that I learned. And life is all about learning, so I've added to my vocabulary over the years. So regardless, she gave me carte blanche to do what I needed to do to sort of express my creativity. And my little lawn world was great for a period of time. There was one thing that continued to drive me a little bit crazy though. Every single time I went to mow, I had to remember to go in the back. We had a swing set, and I would have to put the swings up out of the way so I could actually drive the thing underneath. And again, I've got it good. I can't complain. Goodness knows I've got a very patient, if sailor-like wife. But it just drove me crazy. But every single time, until one particular day, a day with a perfect blue sky. Totally forgot. I was making the turn from the front yard, and in the front yard, as is often the case when you have kids in the house, you end up having to jump down from a mower and pick up whatever's toys and such have been left there. And I made the turn into the backyard, and that's when I looked ahead and I realized I had totally forgotten about the swing set. Now, one thing you should know about me is I'm big on hydration, okay? Particularly on hot summer days as I'm riding around on my beast of a mower. And I had been very careful that day to hydrate properly. I think I lost track of around 5 or 6 hydrations that I had. But I stopped the mower and I was getting ready to dismount, using some of that language that I'd learned, and I was going to throw the swings up out of the way, when I looked down, and one of the things that I had picked up in the front yard was staring up at me. It was a wiffle ball bat. So rather than take the time to go through that monotonous, boring thing to cross the yard and put the swings up, I had what at the time I believed to be the most brilliant idea of my life. Now, there's a term that gets used in our family in reference to me, which is a legend in my own mind. And I have never argued with it because in the history of brilliant ideas, this was not in the top 1,000. So as I looked down at that wiffle ball bat, I realized it wasn't even a wiffle ball bat. It was a lance. I'm big on old movies, Ivanhoe, Robin Hood, really cool knights running toward each other, and the bad guy gets thrown. I looked down, and the wiffle ball bat morphed into a lance, and I looked up, and I realized it was not a swing set. It was actually an evil knight bent on doing harm to my family. So, with a scream of hi-yo silver, I picked up the wiffle ball bat, threw that baby into full gear, and headed, I had to have been doing at least 3 miles an hour, at least. I mean, I'd like to tell you the wind was whipping through my hair, it was more of a gentle waft. But regardless, I was headed for it. Now, I need you to understand this because we've all seen swing sets. You've got the wee little chains with a nice seat. I think I misjudged a little bit. Because if you've seen a wiffle ball bat, it's also only about that big around. And as I approached the swing set, attempting to joust the evil knight, meaning the wiffle ball bat into that chain, to push it out of the way so I could continue my mowing, I not only missed, but my reflexes might not have been what they normally are if I wasn't quite so hydrated at the time. The fascinating thing was the width of the front of the mower fit perfectly between the two chains of the swing. Keep in mind my reflexes. So as I missed, and of course I think I was swinging it and screaming something at the time, it didn't occur to me to stop. So the mower continues, and it fitting perfectly between those two chains, it sort of created a sling. And I kept going, and as I kept going and the swing went up, the front of the mower started to go up and continued to go up until, of course, gravity kicked in and it came down on top of me. Now, everyone in this room is probably thinking, well, what's the big deal? I mean, there are safety features for a reason, right? Sure. If you had bought the mower at a store within the last 20 years, this was a hand-me-down, rebuilt 11 gazillion times by somebody. I have no idea what brand it was. It had 14 different colors, okay, which suited me just fine. It sort of went along with the artwork that I was working on. So, safety features, we don't need no stinking safety features. As that beast came up and back, not only was I pinned underneath, but my hand was pinned and I could not get to the key. My riveted Rocinante had just betrayed me. Luckily, Sancho, otherwise known as my blushing bride, happened to be in the yard. She came running over as I lay there like some sort of mutant turtle with the blades whipping over me. And I'm very, very sure that she was concerned. I couldn't really hear anything, but just as fast as her mouth was moving. And it warmed me at the time. In hindsight, I think that the warmth that I felt was actually the blood circulation being cut off. But she worked very, very hard trying to lift that beast off me just enough so I could get my hand to the ignition key and turn it off, which obviously I did. I don't think that I have ever laughed that hard. And after about 10 seconds, she was laughing with me. We were rolling literally in the grass with tears rolling down our cheeks. At one point, I think she was trying to reassure me that she was okay because it was dangerous. And she wanted to reassure me she hadn't lost any fingers because she showed me one on each hand. It's good to know that she didn't lose any digits. Now, the obvious question, following this is, did I ever do it again? All I can tell you is that, much to my surprise, in Groton, there are a lot of windmills and a lot of evil knights that need slaying. Thank you.
And I had to decide whether I was gonna get on the night.
Very important that the school has certain
Sign up for the sailing program, you don't know how to sail. And I said, because I don't know how to sail.